So I'm about to start sanding these two walnut slabs here, and I wanted to quickly go over my sanding process. I get a lot of questions in regards to what grits I use, what sander I use, so on and so forth. So I'm going to try to clear that up today. The most important part of my sanding process is my sander. I use the Festool RO125, which is a dual mode sander. Two modes. There's rotary mode, which is used for more aggressive removal of stock. And then they have fine sanding mode, which is just random orbit mode, for the lack of a better term. I think that's what you call it. So what I do is I start off my sanding sequence with 40 grit sandpaper in rotary mode. Then I move to 60 grit sandpaper in rotary mode. Then I move to 80 grit sandpaper in rotary mode. Then I move to 100 grit sandpaper in rotary mode. Then I move over to 120 grit sandpaper in rotary mode. And then I sand again with 120 grit sandpaper in random orbit mode. And then I move to 150 grit sandpaper in random orbit mode, 180 grit sandpaper in random orbit mode, 220 grit sandpaper in random orbit mode, and then 320 grit sandpaper in random orbit mode. So for these two grits, 220 and 320, and anything higher than 320, I change out my sanding pad on my RO125 to a soft sanding pad. That's my sanding sequence. So as a quick tip for all of those of you who ask me about swirl marks, if you have swirl marks in any part of this process, the swirl marks will not be removed by a higher grit sandpaper than what they were formed from. So if you're using 100 grit and you see swirl marks and they're not removed by 120 grit, that means that you need to back down to 100. If they're still there, then you need to back down again. The whole point is that the higher grits are gonna not remove the swirl marks from the lower grits. So 220 grit is not gonna remove sand marks, swirl marks that were caused by 100 grit. So my soft sanding pad with 320 grit sandpaper is what I'm going to use to clean up this live edge. So the reason why I use my soft sanding pad and high grit sandpaper to clean up this live edge is because I don't want to change the shape of it. If I use the hard pad as well as like 80 grit sandpaper, it's going to change the shape of this live edge, and I don't want to do that. So